Australian Aviation Podcast, the official podcast of Australian Aviation, unpacking the latest insights, developments and issues impacting Australia's aviation sector.
Hello and welcome to the Australian Aviation Podcast. I'm Jake Nelson. Now, it's an area of aviation we don't hear much about these days, yet at the beginning of the 20th century, it looked to be the future of travel. I'm talking, of course, about the airship. Now, back in the day, nations such as the UK, Germany, and the US were all racing to establish their own airship industries, with mooring masts going up across the world, and it was imagined that Australia might see regular airship services from England. Yet, a well-publicised series of disasters would bring the airship to its knees and pave the way for aeroplanes to dominate the skies, with airships now mainly only serving as giant floating billboards. One such catastrophe was the crash of the British airship R101 in France on the 5th of October 1930. Among the 48 victims was Australian William Palstra, and his granddaughter, author Cecilia Thornton, has written a book, Airship of Dreams, about his last fateful journey. She joins us now. Cecilia, welcome to the show.
I'm glad to be here.
So just to start with, we'll start a bit about you, Cecilia. How did you come to write this book about the R101 and about your grandfather's life?
Okay, well, in the house I grew up in, it was the house that he originally bought with his wife, my grandmother, back in the early 1920s. And I grew up in that house. And there was a massive bureau made of mahogany in the front hall, and it had a secret drawer. And the family knew about the secret drawer, and occasionally we would look into it. And it contained hundreds of letters and war diaries to and from my grandfather, from his parents and his sisters. There was a lot of writing of letters in those days because that was the only way to communicate other than cables, which was very expensive. And just piecing together these letters and diaries and reading through them, I've always thought, all my life, I've thought this is a dramatic story and it needs to be one day told by somebody. Who's going to tell it? Anyway, the whole house was basically kind of haunted by my grandfather, whose tragic loss was a terrible calamity from my mum, who was just a little girl when it happened. And so there was this kind of infiltration of the importance of this story that was untold. And eventually, because I am a writer, I thought, right, I have to do it. I just have to tell this story. It ended up becoming a trilogy dealing with his early life in the infantry in the First World War. Then he became a pilot in the Australian Flying Corps, which was the original RAAF, flying over enemy lines and very exciting stuff. And then the third book is Airship of Dreams, in which he has the war is over, he's come back to Australia, and he's chosen to be aboard this airship on its inaugural flight to India.
So tell us about your grandfather, Will Palstra. From your research, what was he like as a person?
He was modest but ambitious, if that goes together. He never would sort of blow his own trumpet at all, but he was very, very keen to advance in the world. He actually started off as a clerk, an office clerk at the pianola company in Collins Street, Melbourne, when pianolas were all the rage, you know, those player pianos that you sort of pedal them and they play. And he just did office work. He was typing shorthand, all the rest of it, and didn't even think that his life would ever become any different until his brother, Charles, enlisted in the army as soon as war broke out in 1914, and went off and landed on the shores of Gallipoli and was one of the original Anzacs. And then possibly inspired by that, he then enlisted in 1916, my grandfather, and he decided that the life of the army and the Air Force was just too exciting. He didn't want to be a clerk anymore. And yeah, he was very dutiful. He's from a Salvation Army background. So he was very much put others before yourself, the good of the group rather than the individual. And he was also pretty bright. He loved anything electrical or engineering, and he was very interested in engines and motors. So that's the kind of person he was. He was also, I think, a good leader of men. He seemed to rise up through the ranks pretty quickly once he joined the infantry, and then, you know, quickly became eventually a squadron leader in the newly fledged RAAF.
So a more adventurous person than you might have initially assumed from meeting him.
Definitely, yes.
Walk us through how he got involved with the Australian Flying Corps and later the RAAF, because it became a pretty important part of his life.
Yes, well, the RAAF part, or the flying part of his life in aeroplanes, that's in book 3 of this Valiant Heart trilogy. I'm not trying to tout the books, but I'm just trying to put it into perspective here. So he was one of Australia's first Air Force pilots because in 1918 he joined the Australian Flying Corps, flying a variety of biplanes, including Avros, Sopwith Puffs, Sopwith Camels, and RE-8s and SE-5s. And his job was to fly pretty low over enemy lines so that he could distinguish the uniform colours, which ones were our guys and which ones were their guys. The uniform colours were pretty close. So one was khaki, one was field grey. So he had to go pretty low. He was often fired upon. And in fact, back in that house I was telling you about, we have some shrapnel that he sent home, which had been lodged in the back of his seat as he was flying one of his aeroplanes. He didn't get shot down. He survived it. He actually had a medal, got the Military Cross. And, so I think I've sent you some photos of some of the biplanes he was flying, which had a boomerang on the side. One had a kangaroo on the side because he was in number 3 squadron of the AFC, Australian Flying Corps. And, they were the only other Air Force flying. I think the Royal Flying Corps and the AFC were the only 2 Air Forces, as far as I know, besides the German, obviously, that were involved in the war. So he wasn't involved in the airship industry, but he was chosen after the war to be among a limited number of 6 VIP passengers aboard the maiden international flight of the R101 British airship, which was very new at the time and was also the largest airship in the world at the time. It was 777 feet long, which was the largest at the time, but actually was smaller than the famous Hindenburg that everybody knows about, which was 803 feet long. And a lot of people know about the tragedy of the Hindenburg because that was captured on film, but the R101 would have been equally spectacular if it had been captured on film. And at the time, the R101 tragedy made headlines around the world.
So after he came back from the First World War, we'll talk about the R101 a bit later on in the show. But
yes.
After he came back from the war, he was working as a clerk at Melbourne University for a while until he decided to re-enlist in what became the RAAF. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, he went back to work as a clerk again because his shorthand and typing skills were very good. He was very industrious and dutiful and reliable. He helped to set up the Faculty of Commerce at Melbourne University, which was Melbourne's only university at the time. He was living in Surrey Hills. He used to commute every day by train and go in, and he was also doing a university degree at the same time. And he married, had 3 kids, and it was all very 9 to 5 office work, kind of very different from his life in the Army and the Air Force. And I suspect he missed that greatly. And one day by chance, he happened to meet his old comrade, Dickie Williams, who is very high up in the Air Force at the time. And I think they might have met on the train or somewhere in town. And they got to talking about the good old times, roaring around in the sky, getting shot at and having a lot of excitement. And Dickie Williams, who's, quite a heroic figure in the history of the RAAF, I believe, he said, well, why don't you come back? We need people like you. We need experienced pilots like you who can teach the young ones. We're starting up this thing called the RAAF at Point Cook, and we need teachers and we need recruiters. And so, we'll give you a good salary. So my grandfather basically didn't need much encouragement, and he said yes, which meant that he had to, because, you couldn't really drive very quickly from Point Cook to Surrey Hills in those days with the cars they had and the roads they had. So he used to stay down at Point Cook all week and then just return home at the weekend. And my grandmother wasn't that happy with that, but, that was his choice. And he then, when he was based at Point Cook, he used to get into a biplane and fly up to Sydney or fly to Tasmania or fly all around Australia on recruiting drives and give talks and try and encourage other young blokes to join up and become RAAF pilots. He was also then invited to become part of the RAAF contingent at the opening of the brand new Parliament House in Canberra, which up until that point, Melbourne had been Australia's capital city, believe it or not, and Canberra was now to be the new capital city. And he was at the opening of Parliament with, I think it was the Queen's grandfather was there, and my grandfather had his camera and took quite a lot of interesting photos of that as well. So he was sort of rising up and becoming this important person in society.
And he was rising pretty quickly through the ranks of the RAAF as well.
He was, yes. He pretty soon became a squadron leader, and there was a lot of promotion kind of visible ahead of him. And he, as I said, he was ambitious, but in a kind of quiet, gentlemanly way, if you know what I mean. And, he earned what he got. He worked very hard to do the right thing.
Well, we're going to go for a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to be talking more with Cecilia Thornton about the R101 itself and what happened on that last journey. All right, welcome back. You're listening to the Australian Aviation Podcast. We're here with author Cecilia Thornton, who has written a book, Airship of Dreams, about the last fateful journey of the R101 airship and her grandfather, William Palstra. So we talked a bit about the R101 a bit earlier in the show, but can you tell us some more about the ship itself and how it came to be?
Yes, well, at the time, airship travel was seen to be the future of all air travel. And so the reason for this was because that building materials and engineering technology was not up to scratch enough for people to build huge jet airliners. So the monoplane or the aeroplane was just too slow, too dangerous, too small, couldn't carry enough payload. But the airships, they didn't need a landing strip. They could travel long distances without needing to be refueled. The idea was in the Golden Age of Airships, which was the 1920s, there would be these massive mooring masts built all around the world. There were already two of them built by 1930. One was in Karachi and there was going to be one in Melbourne. I think there was already one in the US. The Empire State Building, I think it was, had, a mooring mast facility on top of it. And anyway, so there was going to be this global network, and these airships were going to be as luxurious as the ocean liners. So they were to have, stewards in the dining rooms with white linen tablecloths and potted palms and kind of muted lighting. And it was all going to be this wonderful way of travel, which was supposed to be quite smooth and buoyant. And yeah, that was what was planned. And the British government were building the R101 airship, and a private company, the Airship Guarantee Company, was building the R100 in Britain. And they were kind of a rival. They were supposed to be sharing their ideas and innovations, but they kind of developed a bit of a rivalry. And the R100 airship, which was slightly smaller, happened to be completed before the British government's R101, and it actually took off and flew, I think it was to Canada, and made some successful trips. And meanwhile, the British people were saying, well, what about our taxpayers' money? Why isn't our airship in the sky? And the whole airship industry was quite experimental at that stage. So they wanted to make sure they tested everything and retested everything before they actually let it go off on a journey, because there had been already throughout the 1920s quite a few shocking airship disasters which are on record. Not only British airships, but an Italian one. I think there was a French one. Obviously most of them were lifted by hydrogen, which is a very safe gas as long as it doesn't mix with oxygen. But as soon as it mixes with oxygen, it's highly flammable. And the reason they were lifted by hydrogen is that hydrogen was actually cheap and easy to get. You could actually sort of manufacture it. Whereas helium, which is a much safer gas, if it mixes with oxygen, it doesn't matter. You have to actually mine for helium. It's an element. You can't really make it. And at that point, the only known sources of helium in the world were in the USA, and the USA didn't have very much of it. So they were saying, look, we really need to keep it for our own airships. And it also doesn't have as much lift as hydrogen, interestingly enough. So, it's got a few disadvantages, but to me, the main advantage of helium is it's a lot safer than hydrogen. But anyway, that was the state of the airship industry by the year 1930, when the R101 was considered to be complete enough to take off on her first international voyage to India.
And what was the lead up like for the R101 to that first journey? I understand there were some troubles around its construction and they were trying to accelerate the timetable.
Yes, they were. There was one man in particular who absolutely was obsessed with airships. His name was Lord Thomson of Cardington. He was a politician, and he basically used to speak of them in almost poetic terms. He loved them, and it was actually probably his political influence that kept the airship program on track. He was able to, direct government funds towards it, etc. And his ambition was to fly to India on the first maiden flight of the R101. The reason being he wanted to become the next viceroy of India. And he felt that if he turned up in India sort of triumphantly on this absolutely luxurious Titanic of the skies airship, that he would be more likely to become the next viceroy. And he wanted this trip to happen he wanted it to actually happen quite early in 1930 because of various reasons. There was a conference to be held or something that he wanted to arrive at. But anyway, he was pushing for it to happen quickly. So in 1930, the engineers of the Royal Airship Works were testing via test flights. They were testing the R101, flying her around England, flying her across Bedford because Cardington is in Bedfordshire. They flew her across London. There are some marvellous photos actually from newspapers of the era of her flying across St Paul's Cathedral, St Paul's. And so they did test her, and then they thought, okay, she's not got enough lift for the amount of weight we want her to carry. So in the second half of 1930, they actually took her back into her giant airship shed at Cardington and chopped her in half and inserted another airbag bay or gas bag bay and sewed her up again and fixed her all up because they thought, now they'll have more lift and we can put more passengers and more cargo on board. But we better test her since we've put this new bay in. So they did test her again, but really they'd never really tested her flying in bad weather. And she only just sort of flew over England, a bit out across the sea, but in reasonably good weather, and she never was really going flat out either. And so a lot of the engineers at the Royal Airship Works probably thought, look, we need to do more testing. But Lord Thomson was saying, it's fine. It's a British airship. It'll be fine. It'll work. Let's just go. Stop pussyfooting around it. The whole thing's been delayed for too long and it's making us look bad. So we're going in October, whether you like it or not. He didn't help matters because he was one of the 6 VIP passengers on board, and he insisted on taking a roll of Axminster carpet with him for some reason, which was extremely heavy. And I can't begin to tell you how important every pound of weight is aboard an airship, especially an airship of the 1920s and 1930s. It really makes a difference. To this day, when we jump on a plane, you have to weigh your luggage. Well, it was, if not as important, perhaps more important. But anyway, he insisted on this roll of Axminster carpet and a lot of other luggage. He also sneaked his valet on board, who wasn't really officially supposed to be on board, but he just seemed to think he was very over-optimistic.
So the R101 takes off from England. Can you give us an idea of what happened on that last journey and sort of led up to the crash?
May I read a little bit out of my book?
Absolutely.
Okay. On the evening of Saturday, October the 4th, 1930, rain clouds were piling up in the skies over Bedfordshire, England. At the Cardington Air Base, the British Empire's new airship, the largest object ever to fly, hovered 200 feet above the ground. looking like some surreal deep-sea fish. She was tethered by the nose to the top of her mooring mast. A dazzling beam from a flood lamp pierced the gathering dusk. Against the darkening skies, the massive hull of the cigar-shaped dirigible shimmered silver grey. She floated parallel to the fields below, where a large crowd milled about, their faces upturned, marvelling at the sight. With a length of 770 feet, she was longer than 3 Boeing 747s. That is more than twice the length of an international soccer pitch, or 2.5 times the length of an American football field. Though she was built to float, her gross weight is estimated to have been about 158,000 tonnes. Her hydrogen was capable of lifting that amount. Her motors, carried in 5 egg-shaped gondolas supported beneath the hull, were compression ignition engines developing 585 horsepower each and burning heavy oil. The R101 was a spectacular sight, looming against the rain clouds like some flying monster from an alien world. You can tell that I am also a fiction writer, I guess. Thousands of spectators lined the roads bordering the airbase, whose gates were closed to the general public. Rows of parked motor cars, headlamps blazing, helped to illuminate the scene. At 7:36 p.m, the great airship cast off from her mooring mast and began to rise. "Hurrah, hurrah," chorused the spectators. "Good speed, good luck." To the roar of enthusiastic cheering from the cap-waving crowd below, she slowly gained height, buoyed by the 500,000 cubic feet of hydrogen gas sealed within her envelope. The crew of the airship evidently heard the cheering and responded by flashing their lamps. This was the beginning of the R101's first international voyage, and she was bound for India. Her first stop was to be Ismailia on the Suez Canal in Egypt for refuelling. The 54 men on board, 48 crew members and 6 passengers, were preparing to enjoy a long, comfortable flight. On completion, the R101 boasted luxurious passenger accommodation and service to rival that of the greatest ocean liners. Her sumptuous outfitting could be compared to the ship RMS Titanic. Potted palms and Axminster carpet adorned the elegant dining room. The dinner service had been specially commissioned and bore her insignia. The airship officers wore dark blue uniforms. Their caps bore the blue and gold badge embroidered with Airship R101, topped by a crown representing King George V. The R101 was to be among the first of a fleet of commercial dirigibles, liners of the skies capable of carrying huge numbers of passengers back and forth across the globe. The huge volumes of hydrogen gas carried in bags inside the airship's envelope made her lighter than air. It also made her highly flammable. Officers and crewmen had to wear shoes without nails in the soles, lest the steel strike sparks. Smoking was forbidden, except in the specially fireproofed smoking room. The R101 had been carefully trimmed before leaving the mast, and she slipped her mooring cable without lurching or dipping. A report from the meteorological office had warned Captain Irwin to expect winds of up to 40 to 50 miles per hour, worse than any conditions a British airship had experienced over land in the past. The airship swung easily clear on an almost level keel and very slowly wheeled away to gain height. Moving steadily south, she sent out regular radio messages so that her course could be followed. She circled around the nearby town of Bedford before rising to 1,000 feet, then 1,500 feet, as she moved towards London. Soon after she left Cardington, rain began to fall. As the R101 passed across England heading for the coast, householders peered out of their upper-story windows, eager to see the famous dirigible they had read about in the newspapers. They could see her huge bulk passing by above the treetops. Her lights illuminated the surrounding landscape, glinting on silver spears of rain that stabbed through the darkness. Had the householders been able to look through the airship's windows into the interior, they might have glimpsed the passengers and officers gathered on the promenade deck, enjoying the view of the ground below. The experienced crew on board expressed no concerns about the airship's performance in their wireless messages. At 9:21 p.m, the airship reported, "Over London, all well, moderate rain, course now set for Paris." The message also gave the wind speed as 25 miles per hour, less than anticipated. But being so heavily laden with passengers, luggage, fuel and water ballast, the airship continued to gain altitude slowly. She was still flying quite low when she passed over the capital city, and her own radioed description of her manoeuvre before crossing the hills to the south was gradually increasing height so as to avoid high land. Near Hastings, she left the English coast. So vast was her envelope that the pounding of millions of raindrops on the fabric would add considerably to her weight, and it was raining hard over the English Channel. And burdened beneath the weight of the downpour, the great silver dirigible fought her way with some difficulty, a 35-mile-an-hour sou'wester hammering on her starboard beam. Navigator Johnston ordered the R101 to be brought down from 1,000 feet so that he could see the flare as he dropped on the water to estimate their wind speed and drift. As she passed over the sea, the winds picked up, and she slowly lost height until she reached the alarmingly low altitude of about 750 feet, and those on board could see the white caps of the foaming waves below. At 10 p.m., the height coxswain, whose sole responsibility was maintaining correct altitude, received a visit from the watch officer, Lieutenant Commander Atherstone. As airship officers often did, he took the wheel over himself for a while until he had managed to raise the airship to the 1,000 feet designated cruising altitude. Then he handed back the controls to the coxswain, warning him not to let the R101 go below 1,000 feet again. By the time the R101 had reached the French coast, the engineers had corrected a mechanical problem with her engines. She made France over the Point de Saint-Quentin, I don't know how to pronounce that, and set a course for Paris. Strong winds were pummeling her vast envelope and rain poured down in torrents. At midnight, the airship sent out a further message. In spite of the rough weather conditions and serious trouble in maintaining height, its words betrayed no real fears on the part of the airship's guests and crew. After an excellent supper, our distinguished passengers smoked a final cigar, and having sighted the French coast, have now gone to bed to rest after the excitement of their leave-taking. All essential services are functioning satisfactorily. The crew have settled down to watch-keeping routine. R101 sent out regular position reports at 1:28 a.m. At 1:30, she passed over the village of Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, appearing so low that the inhabitants scrambled from their beds, certain she would scrape the roofs off their houses. Slowly, the airship thundered away into the pitch-dark night. She sent out another routine wireless transmission at 1:51, by which time she was approaching Beauvais, north of Paris. As she passed slightly to the east of the town, the roar of her engines awoke the townsfolk and frightened the children. People rushed to the windows to catch a glimpse of this historic sight, the majestic dirigible flying over their heads, with her red and green warning lights twinkling, buffeted by rain and storm clouds. After 2:07 a.m., there were no more messages from the R101. Just outside Beauvais, with no warning at all, she went into a steep dive. She tilted so sharply that the engineers manning the ship were thrown off balance, and furniture shot forward across the decks. The height coxswain pulled hard on his wheel in an effort to right the airship and managed to get her on an even keel once more. Within seconds, however, she plunged down again, and this time the coxswain could do nothing to pull her out of the dive. The officers in command could see what was coming. They ordered all engines to reduce power, although in the confusion one engineer may not have received the signal, and warning bells were rung throughout the airship. It's difficult to imagine, but there was no panic. Airship flight is normally so smooth and buoyant, and altitude changes so much a part of the pattern, that few people would leap to the idea of crashing in the way that modern aircraft passengers might. The professional men on board were trained to remain calm in dangerous situations. Besides, it was just not the thing to panic in front of one's peers. Perhaps also their faith in God and the British Air Ministry held firm. The chief coxswain had time to go aft where the crew members were sleeping, and to announce quite matter-of-factly, "We're down, lads." And with a great grinding noise of engines ceasing and metal grating on metal, the airship lumbered to the earth and slid several yards along the ground. Then, less than a minute after her last wireless transmission, she exploded into flames. A crashing roar swept through the valley as 5.5 million cubic feet of hydrogen ignited. It shook the nearby village of Alon to its foundations and shattered windows. Sheets of flame towered into the sky. The furnace that was once an airship lit up the countryside with a ghastly yellow light, like some nightmarish sun. Night had turned into day. People in the vicinity of Beauvais were awakened by the thunder. On rushing to their windows, they saw streaks of light soaring across the sky. Next day, all that could be seen was a massive tangle of scorched metal. The twisted, burnt and charred framework was all that remained of the glorious R101. She had been completely destroyed by fire. 48 men perished out of a total of 54 passengers and crew. That tragedy finished the British airship industry and was counted among the worst disasters of the 20th century. One of those aboard was Squadron Leader William Palstra, MC, BA, and this is his story.
It does sound like it would have been an absolutely sort of harrowing experience right at the end there for the people on board. And as we'll touch on more later, a disaster for the British airship industry. Now, there would have been, I believe you mentioned in your book, there was an inquiry afterwards into the disaster. Based on your research and based on sort of what's come out or what came out at the time, why did the R101 crash?
Well, I think the consensus is that it was not tested thoroughly enough. There have been, people are still going through the records to this day and probing the reasons why it happened. There are ideas such as it lost height, and then when it touched the ground, the slightest spark, there could have been two wires rubbing together inside the, near the gas bags. The gas bags were encased in kind of a wire framework. There could have been two girders that sort of buckled and caused a spark. So it's come down. It was too heavy. It was being weighed down by the rain that was falling on its massive envelope. And when it came down, something has ignited the hydrogen. The hydrogen, has obviously escaped and mixed with oxygen, and there's been a spark. And that's all it took, was one little spark. So, yeah, there's kind of, the consensus was that it was a rushed job. It wasn't tested thoroughly enough. However, the exact cause, I don't know, has ever been revealed.
You wouldn't think of rain as, being something that could bring down an airship. But I believe you mentioned in your book, the impact of all of this rain on top of such a vast envelope, that would have added up.
It really would have, because it was a massive surface area, and one little raindrop doesn't weigh much, but a lot of them pounding on this huge envelope would have had an effect. Look, there were other problems, like the gas bags were made out of gold beater skin, which is the intestines of millions of bullocks, because that's what they had to use as their fabrics. They got the intestines of bullocks from some abattoirs and stitched them together to make the gas bags. And obviously this isn't it's not a very strong fabric. It's not like the fabrics we have these days. The actual outer covering of the envelope too was covered with a thing called dope, which is like a kind of a gooey paint that they use to try and kind of waterproof and seal it. And this could rub off or come off, allowing water from the storm to get inside, and then again causing it to lose altitude. So a lot of things were working against this airship staying in the sky.
You'd have to think that one of these things would be, all the decisions made by this Lord Thompson character, wouldn't you? This is, decision to rush the airship and, sneak his valet on board and bring heavy carpets and all of his luggage.
Very much so. But I think it's the old story. He was a politician. Perhaps politicians have their reasons for trying to make certain things happen at certain times. He was ambitious. He wanted to become the Viceroy of India. And, a lot of people also kind of had blind faith in, it'll be right. It's the British Air Ministry and they'll be fine. And they were. Look, the engineers and the pilots were very talented, intelligent guys. And I would imagine that many of them had their own kind of reservations about this flight. And in fact, there is on record, there is things like one of them said goodbye to his son and said to him, "Son, as I'm going on the R101 now. Just promise me one thing." And his son said, "What's that?" He said, "Don't ever go into the Air Force." So he kind of, and Lord Thompson too made out his will on the day before he boarded the airship. So, they kind of had it in the back of their mind that maybe things weren't going to be as good as they hoped, but they just took the risk anyway.
Well, we're going to go for one more quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the airship industry at the time and the impact that the crash had. All right, welcome back. You're listening to the Australian Aviation Podcast. We're speaking with author Cecilia Thornton, who's written a book, Airship of Dreams, about the last journey of the British airship R101 and her grandfather who was on board. Now, we've touched a bit on this earlier in the show, but at the time, as you've said, airships were regarded as the future of aviation and the future of travel. Why were they so popular?
Well, one of the reasons was that aeroplanes, big ones, couldn't be built. They didn't have the materials or the technology to build great big jet airliners that we have today. Also, aeroplanes required runways, whereas airships didn't. And they needed to be refueled very often. They had to do short hops. So for international travel, they were quite awkward and cramped, and they couldn't carry a lot. Whereas people were familiar with ocean liners, and perhaps in their mind, an airship closely resembled that. A lot of the airship terminology is ocean terminology, port and starboard, etc. The coxswain, I don't even know if I pronounced that correctly. But, so airships were seen as as an ocean liner of the sky. You would sit in a nice dining room, looking out over the scenery and the landscape passing below as a steward served you your beautiful meal on the beautiful china that was specially designed for the airship. It would kind of float majestically through the sky. You could walk around, you could dance. They had a dance floor. They had, luxury everywhere. And it was just considered, it was obvious, this is how long distance travel was going to be, as compared to being in a tiny little box or a little tube of an airplane with very little room that had to stop every now and again and get more fuel on board.
You'd have to wonder what they might think if they saw an A380, for example.
They would be amazed.
So the crash of the R101, you mentioned that it was sort of the end of the British airship industry. You talk us a bit through that and, as well, these other disasters that we saw, these French disasters, the American disasters, and of course the Hindenburg later on in the 1930s. How did these sort of really bring an end to the airship industry?
Well, the crash of the R101 actually completely brought to a halt the British airship industry, but it didn't affect so much airship development in other countries. But following the R101 disaster, which made headlines all around the world, and in fact, part of the book is devoted to the aftermath of that, in which the coffins, the 48 coffins, were lined up in Westminster Hall, which happens to be where Queen Elizabeth II, her coffin lay. And it's not usually given to civilians to lie in that hall, but they were put there. And in London, it took 24 hours for the public to file past the coffins and pay their respects. So it just really hit hard. There were some very well-known and talented officers and engineers and crew aboard that ship. And the whole project had been going for years and years, and it was seen as being a kind of a crowning achievement of the British Empire. And it absolutely shattered them, to the extent that the airship ministry wheeled out the sister ship, the R100, which had made successful flights around the world and was completely intact. And they just took all the gas out of her and they actually steamrolled her framework. and they steamrolled all the girders into a little mass and they took her off to be melted down for something else. And they said, we're just not going to do this anymore. So that was the end of the British airship industry. But Germany had always had a lot of success with zeppelins, and Graf Zeppelin had done major flights all around the world, and they kept going. And other countries kept going too. But then again in the, as you say, 1936, I think it was, when the Hindenburg burst into flames, people just were thinking, all right, okay, that's it. No more airships. The airships are done. Let's focus on something else. And then by that time, new technology and new materials have been developed, and people were able to start building bigger, faster, more reliable airplanes to carry more passengers and cargo.
And on a sort of more personal level, the loss of Will aboard the R101, what impact did that have on your family?
Huge impact. My mother was 9 at the time. And what had happened is that they had been, obviously they were living in Australia, but he'd been chosen to represent Australia over in London at, I think, Australia House, and to do a course over there in London. So he was by now a squadron leader in the RAAF. So they went across on an all expenses paid 2-year trip to England. And that 2 years was this amazing experience for my mum, who was 7 when she arrived. They arrived in spring, and she's a big nature lover, my mum, and she was absolutely entranced by the kind of bluebell woods and blossoms of England. And they had a maid servant. They lived in this big house. They used to entertain all these Air Ministry officials. They had a car. Nobody had a car. They had a car. And this 2 years in England was full of holidays and tours and wonderful things. Then, my grandfather, her father, who she loved, very deeply, was sort of selected for this amazing opportunity, going aboard this wonderful airship. And when what happened, and they got this dreadful telegram, which the telegram's still in that secret drawer, by the way, it just was, her whole world collapsed. There was no counselling. It was like, oh, stiff upper lip, you'll be fine. They just got packed off to Australia, where instead of living in this high life, they lived on a kind of war widow's pension. And my grandmother was inconsolable. She was distraught. So my mum was basically living in a house with no father, with a mother that cried every day, and 2 younger siblings. So that affected her very deeply. And to the extent that she never left that house. She stayed living in the house. She actually died in the house. She couldn't leave it because it held all the memories of her father. So it did affect. And then, you see, as kids growing up, we didn't know any of that, but there was a vibe, and we picked up the vibe, and we also read the letters. So it was like being haunted a bit, because we were living in the house where Mum had grown up, where her father and mother had been so happy together. And, trees that he planted were there growing and fruiting. So, he was very much this invisible presence in our lives.
Taking a broader view again now, had all of these disasters never occurred, what do you think might have become of the airship industry? Because, obviously nowadays planes are definitely faster and more convenient, but might we have seen more evolution in airships? Might we have seen airships taking on sort of an ocean liner role, like, holiday cruise ships perhaps?
So I think so, definitely. And in fact, you might be aware there is actually a movement in that direction. People are building airships nowadays. I think there's one, I think it's called the Airlander. You can go on an airship on a pleasure cruise these days. You can do that. I think it might be in Switzerland. Yes, I definitely think there would have been a place for them as safer methods were developed. It would be an amazing thing to go on one and to feel the floor tremble slightly under your feet as you step onto it. Very different from going on a plane, very different. In fact, the closest I have been hot air ballooning, and because I wanted to know what it would be like. And I think hot air ballooning is the closest I've been to it.
Because nowadays, most people, when they think of an airship, they generally would tend to think of something like the Goodyear blimp, which is, and there's not a lot of, blimps around. And I don't think there's, really that many or any dirigibles either. So it's an interesting sort of look at what could have been, perhaps.
It is, but as I said, I think, look, don't quote me on this, but I think there is an airship called the Airlander, which looks very different. It's aerodynamically designed, but it is actually a proper dirigible airship, which is flying at the moment. And there is, look, this whole coterie of airship enthusiasts across the world, people who are as obsessed with them as probably I am too. And they want to bring them back. They want to fly in them again. And I think they will.
Well, it would be very interesting to see that happen again. Just to sort of bring this to a close, if there's one thing that you want readers to take away from this book and from the eventual trilogy, what would that be?
That's a good question. I kind of wish you'd given me that question to start with. I could never think about it. But for me, it was just, it's an important event in world history that at the time was global headlines, and it's been forgotten, and I don't want it to be forgotten. And I think it's important to remember things like that, because hopefully we can learn lessons from it. You know, lessons about being more careful, less hasty, you know, not putting political ambitions ahead of the reality of physics. You know, hopefully we can learn that. And also just personally for me is to highlight this man that I never met, but who had this massive influence on my life.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Cecilia Thornton. Now, your book, Airship of Dreams, is out now. If our readers are interested in picking it up, where can they find it?
Well, it should be available basically everywhere. It's definitely at most online bookshops. And if they want to order it from their local bookshop, that would be very easy to do. If it's not already in there, then their local bookshop would be definitely able to order it. It's distributed by Ingram, which is a massive distribution company, and they'll just distribute it to any bookshops that want to order it.
And there are 2 more books coming in the trilogy about the early life of Will Palstra.
Yes, the trilogy is called the Valiant Heart Trilogy. Book 1 is Airship of Dreams, and then Book 2 is kind of a flashback to when he joined and his infantry training. Book 3 is Blood and Fire, and that's about him when he joined the AFC, the Australian Flying Corps, and it details some of his pretty hair-raising adventures, you know, as he zapped across the enemy lines in his biplane. And, so they're the 3 books, and, you know, they're basically just all coming out pretty much now.
And we will very much look forward to seeing them. In the meantime, thank you, Cecilia Thornton, for that look at an underreported area of aviation history and the industry. That's it for the Australian Aviation Podcast for today. I am Jake Nelson. Thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time.
There she goes, she's away. Rising majestically.